Welcome to the third episode in a Legendarium series about the Black Death. This episode, An Empire in Flames, will focus on the plague spread throughout the British Isles, including England, Scotland, and Wales, along with its arrival in the Holy Roman Empire, what is today Germany. The Black Death in the Holy Roman Empire led to two more tragedies. First, a fresh outbreak of anti-Semitism, which led to many pogroms against the Jews of Central Europe, and the rise of a bizarre religious sect called the Flagellants, which hoped to win God's mercy by beating themselves bloody with whips. The Black Death arrived in the south of England in 1348 and spread through the rest of the country. By 1349, residents in the north of England knew full well that the plague was coming. They had no choice but to continue preparing for the next harvest, even as they listened to rumors and their priests. Across the north of England, priests proclaimed that the plague was a test sent by God to strengthen the faithful. Tragically, the unsanitary conditions of many medieval cities meant this test would be even more severe. The filth which pervaded many medieval towns made good conditions for rats, which carried the plague fleas. Bristol, the first English city stricken with the plague, was reported as having dirt streets paved with mulch made from human and animal urine and feces, dead animals, and guts left by the butchers after they were finished slaughtering beasts. Semi-feral pigs owned by townspeople roamed the streets, sometimes eating those who died of the plague. Rivers were little better than open sewers, and the city of York alone suffered a mortality rate of 40%. However, the abbeys of England, filled with monks not inclined to wash, thrown away food, and dank corridors, became magnets for rats and thus plague fleas. Monasteries in England suffered mortality rates as high as 80%. When burying the dead, the English had to stack corpses 5 high to ensure that all would be buried in consecrated ground. Just to the north, the Scots decided to take advantage of the English plague by gathering in the forest of Selkirk for an invasion of England. However, the plague spread across the northern border and struck down so many of the Selkirk army that the survivors dispersed home. In doing so, they spread the plague across Scotland. Fortunately, the Black Death did not adapt well to the rough terrain and cooler climate of the north. Less than a third of Scotland died. Though still terrifying, this was much better than what the English, French, and Italians endured. The plague also spread west to Wales, which lived under English rule. The Black Death struck down both the Welsh and the English settlers who ruled over them. While the Welsh living in isolated mountain villages suffered far fewer deaths, the Welsh on the English border suffered far more. One of the English overlords at Whitchurch, John Lestrange, died, followed within days by his brother Humphrey and eldest son Fulk. By the time that John's only surviving son, also named John, examined the Lestrange estate, he learned that his father's holding was all but worthless because there were no tenants left to work it. Order broke down across the Anglo-Welsh border. The court rolls filled with stories of armed bands breaking into houses to steal everything they could, from livestock like oxen and cows to things as small as water pitchers and basins. The plague also spread across the Irish Sea, where it hit the English settlements along the Irish Sea coast the hardest, while apparently sparing the Irish interior. With 20 million subjects, the Holy Roman Empire was the most populous state in Christendom, home to over 1/4 of Europe population. The plague spread from France and Italy into Germany sometime in the spring of 1349. German cities suffered appalling rates of mortality. Strasbourg, Mainz, and Hamburg saw over 60% of their citizens perish within a year. In Bremen, the death toll exceeded 70%. In the German countryside, one chronicler wrote of men and women driven to despair and wandering the countryside as if mad. Cattle were left to stray unattended, and wolves came down from the mountains to attack sheep, as there were no more shepherds left to drive them off. In Vienna, 1/3 of the population died in only 2 months. One chronicler who lived through the Vienna plague summer wrote of mothers dying of the Black Death with babies still in their arms and the babies still trying to nurse from their dead mothers. Another story told of a little girl who tried to join her dead mother on the cart carrying the dead out of Vienna. Though the corpse bearers forced the girl to climb off, they were moved to tears by the sorrowful plight of the young orphan. During the plague years, a legend sprang up in German-speaking lands of Pestjungfrau, an evil plague goddess who was said to emerge from the mouths of the dead in a glowing stream of blue flame. Once free, Pestjungfrau needed only to raise her hand to strike down yet more of the living. However, another myth, that of the Jews spreading the plague by poisoning wells, had very real and tragic consequences. Towards the end of 1348, Pope Clement VI issued a bull in which he declared that Christians who blamed the Jews for the Black Death had been deceived by Satan. In the bull, Pope Clement noted that the Black Death came to places where no Jews lived, and that the plague killed Jews and Christians alike without discrimination. However, the Pope's voice did not make much difference among the anti-Semitic fanatics who ran riot in the Holy Roman Empire. Indeed, across Germany, the belief that Jews were poisoning wells transformed into a far-reaching conspiracy theory, telling of an international cabal of Jews, supposedly led by a shadowy figure named Rabbi Jacob, poisoning wells with tainted communion wafers. On January 9, 1349, the whole community of Jews in Basel were dragged from their homes by a Christian mob. The mob forced them into a wooden house built specially for the occasion, set it on fire, and burned men, women, and children to death. In nearby Strasbourg, before the plague even arrived, 2,000 Jews were taken to the local cemetery. All those who converted to Christianity were spared, and all those who refused were burned at the stake. Now a new and even more dangerous force emerged against Europe's Jews. In a desperate appeal for God's mercy, bands of people as large as 1,000 strong began traveling the countryside. Upon arriving in a village or town, they stripped to the waist and beat their backs blue, bloody, and swollen with leather whips tipped with iron spikes. They hoped that by beating themselves, they would earn God's pity and forgiveness for the sins which brought the Black Death upon Europe. Their self-mutilation turned into elaborate rituals. They wore hoods, white cloaks with red crosses stitched upon them, and marched barefoot. They covered themselves with ashes, weeping and singing hymns as they streamed through the countryside. Their bands included not only peasant toilers, but knights, nobles, and sometimes apostate priests who rose to become masters of the Flagellants. Upon arriving in a town, the Flagellants marched to the local church, stripped to the waist, and collapsed after beating themselves bloody with their whips. Then the master of the group would beat them even more with a stick, from which 3 ropes with large knots hung, bloodying the troop even more. These so-called Flagellants did not bathe, change their clothes, sleep in beds, or even talk without permission from the master. Throughout 1349, bands of Flagellants appeared in the Low Countries, eastern France, and much of Germany. To a desperate populace, they appeared to offer salvation. In many towns, the Flagellants were greeted with the ringing of church bells. People rushed into the streets, heading to the churches to meet them. People even dipped pieces of cloth into their raw, oozing wounds and stroked their faces with flagellant blood as if it were holy relics. Ironically, the Flagellants may have helped to spread the Black Death even further because their open, weeping wounds were fertile grounds for plague fleas. However, to the Jews, the rabidly anti-Semitic Flagellants brought only death. Whenever they arrived in a town, they headed to the Jewish quarter if one could be found and burned the Jews alive in their houses. The city of Mainz saw a pitched battle between Jews and Flagellants, which ended with all 200 Jews in the city being murdered. King Casimir of Poland, influenced by his Jewish mistress Esther, gave refuge to rivers of Jewish refugees fleeing the Holy Roman Empire. Pope Clement VI condemned the Flagellants, not only for their behavior but their attacks on Jews. Likely in part because of this, the Flagellants also became rabidly anti-clerical. When priests tried to stop Flagellants from entering a town, the Flagellants stoned them to death. Then they broke into churches to disrupt services, mocked the Eucharist, looted altars, drove priests from the church with whips, and claimed the power to cast out evil spirits and even raise the dead. In October 1349, the Pope called for the dispersal and arrest of the Flagellants. Local magistrates were ordered to close their gates to them. Local rulers across Germany and France forbade public flagellation on pain of death. Local rulers seized, hung, and beheaded the Flagellants. Within a matter of weeks, the Flagellants lost their appetite for martyrdom and vanished as suddenly as they arrived. A few isolated bands remained, but they would be suppressed by 1357. With their dispersal, Jews who fled France and the Holy Roman Empire began to trickle home. However, many remained in Poland, where they formed Jewish communities that lasted until the Holocaust, 600 years later. As the year 1349 drew to a close, anywhere from 30 million to 40 million Europeans had died. How much longer could the plague continue before none remained? We'll find out in the next episode. I hope that you enjoyed this episode of The Legendarium. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.